Let me pray for you and pray for us as well. Here, let us pray. God of love, you created every person in your image and breathed dignity into every human life. Open our eyes to see one another as you see us, beloved, worthy, and deeply connected. Give us hearts wide enough to care for our neighbors, courage enough to stand with those who are struggling, and compassion that moves beyond words into action. Let us be encouraged and inspired by the life of Dorothea Dix, who embodied the compassion of Christ, and may we also follow the way of Jesus, welcoming the stranger, lifting up the overlooked, and choosing love wherever we go. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Nice. Okay, here's my friend, this mic, right? This mic is my friend, right? We're gonna trip over this mic today. Let's see, how are we doing? Actually, I need to.
Turn that around.
Well, yeah. Still happening?
Yeah.
Right. This is great. Well, those of you who were here at the presentation I did previously know I always include a video, and I always want you all to do some talking at your table. So that'll be the same style today, all right? Hello, I'm Ann Riley. I'm happy to be here. I kind of volunteered myself with Greg months ago to say I'd like to do something for Women's History Month. I really didn't know until about last week who I was going to talk about. It made sense to do Dorothea Dix. So I'm learning about her too, actually. All right, One Women's Crusade. We're kind of guided today by what and why and who and how, when. Every slide's going to be kind of along those lines. So just in terms of how we're going to proceed today. All right, so here we are. Why did I choose Dorothea Dix? Number one, it's Women's History Month. Number two, she's known through Dix Park, right? Of course, I didn't know about that until I moved here in about 2021. And then I went, what? There's a park named after Dorothea Dix? That's amazing. Went to see the sunflowers, all of that. Like, what else? What else? So I'm a social worker by profession. I was in clinical practice there as a therapist, working with families for over 20 years, and I've been in academics for over 20 years now. So I've always heard of Dorothea Dix, but honestly had never really studied her. I knew she was involved in early social reform with mental health issues. That's about all I knew. So we'll hear a bit about her and learn a bit about her. But also then, because she was such a social reformer, kind of the terminology they used back then, that brings us to social justice issues and advocacy, and I got to looking into the Episcopal Diocese website and what do they have to say about that, and it all ties together, and I hope it will today. The other personal reason is because, I don't know about you, but we've had several folks in my family, in my history, who have had mental health struggles. And I'll just share with you personally, for me, that was my mother. I was an only child, and so I was very involved in helping my mother to cope kind of throughout my life. I remember bringing her instant coffee at about the age of 5 to get her up in the morning to take her to school, that kind of stuff, when she was struggling with depression. And she was institutionalized a number of times throughout my life as well. So it's all of interest to me on many different levels. So that's my why. All right, there she is. Those are the photos that we have of her. As I say, occupational social reformer. So who was Dorothea Dix? She was an author, a teacher, a reformer. Her efforts on behalf of the mentally ill and prisoners helped to create dozens of new institutions that didn't previously exist all across the United States and Europe, and changed people's perceptions about this population. We still have mental health stigma, and so we're not going to get into that. That would be a sidebar that I would have to pull myself back from in a rabbit hole, so we won't go there today, but always. She had a troubled family background herself. I think many of us end up in career fields that somehow connect to our early experiences. Not everyone. She was from an impoverished family, and that really did spark her interest, in all of these causes and her cares. So she was born in Hamden, Maine. I've never been there, but you all may have been. 1802, a long time ago. Her father, Joseph, was an itinerant minister, Methodist minister. So he was traveling, gone a lot. She was the oldest of 3 children, and her mother suffered from debilitating depression frequently. So as a very little girl, she took care of the household, took care of the family, the 2 younger brothers, and her mama. Then Dad would come home. Father was described as being very strict, and volatile, but taught her to read and write. So in the early 1800s, for a girl to be able to read and write was a gift, and that really sparked her love of learning and reading and writing and all of that, which contributed to her capacity to be a social reformer. So those early years were unpredictable and rather lonely, a lot on her shoulders, right? By the age of 12, she and her brothers went to live with a wealthy aunt in the Boston area, a wealthy grandmother in the Boston area, who took them in and continued to foster that interest in education. She says eventually, really, she was 14 when she opened a first school for other children, created the curriculum, just an amazing young person, right? By the time she was kind of in her 20s, she had her own health issues and whatnot, so and the schools closed, but she was very involved in education early on. By 18, I want to say 19, but we know it's 18, 36, at about the age of 32, she took a job teaching inmates at East Camden Prison in Massachusetts. Conditions were described as abysmal. Treatment of prisoners so inhumane, she began agitating at once for their improvement. Really wanted to do something, just could not stand what she was seeing. During the same time in history, though, about the 1830s and 40s, were all kinds of movements for humanitarian concerns and humanitarian efforts. There were movements already for prison reform. She wasn't the only one with a voice for that. Women's rights, suffrage was going on, anti-slavery movement, and there were new ways of treating the mentally ill. As I look back and look at some, I purchased The Snake Pit, which is an old novel, if you've ever heard of that, published in 1946, about one woman's experience in institutional care. It was not good to our standards today, but apparently was a big improvement from being thrown into a snake pit. I'll just tell you what that was about briefly. I had never known this, but it turns out that a snake pit was an early, I don't know when, I guess prior to, well, perhaps about 1800 when Dorothea was born. They believed that if you could take a sane person and throw them into a snake pit and it would drive them crazy, that if we take a crazy person and throw them into a snake pit, it would make them sane. That's where this title comes from this really, decades old novel autobiography of a case. All right, so that's how bad things were. However, lots of movement going on for social causes, right? Social concerns. So this asylum movement really began with this emphasis on separating and building mental health hospitals as separate from prisons, which were also almshouses for the poor. Kind of that's where everybody got thrown into, right? All right, prisons at that time were unregulated and unhygienic. One of the reasons that I'm talking about this and describing it is because we're going to watch this video and just the scenes are horrible, and so she'll say some of the same things I'm saying, but I just thought I would preempt that. Torture was involved. I don't think they show any specific torture, but being chained just because you're really ill is torture, right? All right, so they were unregulated, unhygienic, violent criminals housed side by side with those who are mentally ill, inmates often subject to the whims and brutalities of their jailers. So she visited every public and private facility that she could access. She documented the conditions in graphic detail, unflinching honesty. And so these reports then she gave to legislators going about pleading for reform for prisons and for the mentally ill. They were filled with dramatic accounts, right? Flogged, starved, chained, sexually abused, left naked, no heat, no sanitation, etc. Really horrible. And it helped to galvanize a movement. All right. In the North Carolina legislature then, so back to us, right? Measures had been proposed for almost 20 years. There were a couple of governors back then. There were legislators who really wanted this reform, wanted to do something in North Carolina, and they never passed. So almost 20 years worth of really trying to get things through. She came here, set her sights on North Carolina by 1848, began visiting prisons, doing her thing, collecting data, documenting in detail all the conditions that existed here, which were similar to everywhere else in the country at that time. They were presented to the General Assembly, and finally, after an impassioned plea by a leading Democrat, James Dobbins was his name at the time, because his wife encouraged him to. Behind every good man is a woman, right? The legislature passed finally in January of 1849 to establish a mental health hospital in North Carolina. It hadn't been done before. So it took 7 years to get architecture, the construction, the funds, appropriations, and all of that to construct this new hospital that sat atop a hill overlooking the city of Raleigh. It was originally known as North Carolina Hospital for the Mentally Ill, and it housed 274 patients. According to this, they might have had overflow on many occasions, but it was built for 274 patients. During her lifetime, she refused to allow the hospital to name it after her. She refused that. She did agree that the land on which the hospital was built could be called Dix Hill in honor of her father. Later, by 1959, that's the year I was born, the General Assembly voted to change the institution's name to Dorothea Dix Hospital, and so that's what it's known of as today, although it doesn't exist anymore. So it stood there from 1856, after 7 years of construction, right, and opening, to 2012. More than 150 years. It was the preeminent mental health institution that we had here, known as an asylum for the insane, and that was an improved terminology over just being thrown in with violent criminals, right? However, sadly, due primarily to lack of funding, the process of closing the hospital began in about 2000. So by 2010, it was announced that it would close its doors. By 2012, the last patients were relocated to Central Regional Hospital in Butner. Is that how we say it? Not Buhner, Butner, right? Just up the road. In 2015, the state approved the sale of 300 plus acres to the city of Raleigh for the development of Dorothea Dix Park that we know today, right? And that building still stands. Okay, that was the who. All right, here's our video. We're going to watch about 6 minutes of this. Don't know why the sound isn't on again. We obviously don't have photos of what was going on back then, and today we wouldn't either. Just due to confidentiality issues, but they're drawing to get the idea.
Someone else will discuss.
Blasting.
Cover the next thing.
Well, I turned it off. It seems so loud. Doesn't that just seem like crazy loud?
Some people might say now is not the time to open the door. You gotta be kidding with that, you mess.
Not a chance.
How would that sound
See a
okay?
better future? It's on us
Up a little, oh, it's fine, okay. Fine back on the back.
to make the way.
Skip. I'm telling it to skip, but it's not.
Be the future you want to see. Be revolutionary.
It's on.
Cold, dark, chains. Prisoners in early America were condemned to this fate. Hardened criminals were housed with feeble-minded children, and the same with the mentally ill, in cramped rooms with no form of light or heat. The citizens knew little and cared less, having been led to believe that the criminals and the insane were animals and could be treated as such. Dorothea Dix was on a crusade to change this. A strong woman with initiative and perseverance, she transformed the lives of the outcasts of society. Despite working at a time of ongoing social revolution, that may have diverted emphasis from her cause and the unrealistic ideals of men that insisted that a woman should be docile and dependent. She pushed through barriers and got things done. The Civil War itself didn't prevent her from speaking for those who had no voice. Few other people could have carried out such a devoted service. Despite being a woman in pre-Civil War America, Dorothea Dix's perseverance, stamina, compassion, and intelligence allowed her to accomplish much in a very short, volatile period of time. April 4th, 1802, Dorothea Dix was born into an America barely a quarter century old. She showed her resourcefulness when she ran away from a loveless home at age 12 and opened a successful private school 2 years later. She outshined most young women her age and kept her inquiring mind throughout her career. She joined the Unitarian Church in the early 1820s and found friends and a home amongst its members. As a favor to a student of the church, she visited East Cambridge Jail in March 1841 to teach Sunday school to a group of incarcerated women. What awaited there shocked her. In an unheated room, a variety of prisoners lived together, and inmates had insufficient access to the most basic needs, such as food and water. When she asked to see the insane prisoners, the guard led her down a dimly lit stairway into a pen of screaming people, lying in hay like animals. A mad woman was chained to the wall, screaming in agony, freezing from the lack of fire. Dix walked up to her and gently touched her on the shoulder. She inquired to the guard about why the woman had no fire to warm her. "These people don't need a fire. It wouldn't be safe for them. They'd burn themselves up," said the guard. Dix left the prison distraught. Upon conversing with her good friend, Dr. William Ellery Channing, he urged her to take action against what she'd seen. Because she had severe tuberculosis and the coming year threatened to be her last, he told her, "Make that year do, Dorothea. Remember, everyone needs care and compassion, even the criminals and the insane." These words set in motion thoughts that would lead her on a 40-year crusade for the rights of the imprisoned, impoverished, and insane. She began to wonder about the conditions of prisons in rural Massachusetts and started traveling to view different penitentiaries in a mission for reform. Upon her entry into politics, she realized what a great undertaking it would be to change such long-established institutions. Most Americans didn't know about the jail conditions, or they put it out of their minds so that they could live guilt-free. But when Dorothea Dix wrote, her words reached the public like none before her. Her eloquence, combined with the emergence of the newspaper, provided the ideal theater for her views. When she'd earned the support of leading Bostonians, she wrote a memorial to the Massachusetts legislature, which was presented in 1843 by Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe. "It is not few, but many. It is not a part, but the whole who bear unqualified testimony to this evil. A voice strong and deep comes up from every almshouse and prison in Massachusetts, where the insane are or have been protesting against such evils. Gentlemen, I commit to you the sacred cause." She used powerful emotional language that couldn't be ignored, and she quickly gained supporters in the government. Her 1843 Massachusetts memorial was followed by visits to asylums and prisons in many states, including New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky. Everywhere she went, she surveyed prisons, published more memorials, and pleaded for the humane treatment of the lost souls rotting in almshouses before state legislatures. From 1848 to 1854, she lobbied the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives for a bill that would utilize 12,255,000 acres of government land for asylums, which was supported by President Millard Fillmore but vetoed by the next president, Franklin Pierce.
Well, I think the thing that's really stands out about Dorothea Dix, and to maybe a lesser extent all women reformers, is her single-mindedness. She is really driven about her cause. And that's sort of what enables her, what pushes her forward and her cause forward.
After the 1854 defeat of her bill, she traveled to England and, upon finding the vast differences between wealthy and impoverished jails, she visited many different countries in later years, advancing reforms for the insane. Though her causes were noble and far-reaching, some people were prejudiced against her arguments because she was a woman walking alone in a man's world.
But women reformers were seen as, they had really abandoned their number one role, which was to be wives and mothers. And they were putting themselves forward, they were public, and they were often caricatured in the press, they were made fun of, they made ugly cartoons of them.
Dorothea Dix found ways to use her gender to her advantage. She was naturally sympathetic to those who had illness because she had illness herself, and she used her passion to convince other people, men and women, especially men in power. She made sure that she didn't seem like a threat to them, and she wasn't a threat because she had such little power. But at first, she was very careful not to cross men. It was a very smart way to get people on her side, by complimenting them. She would often address her reports on prisons to enlightened and benevolent men. She knew her audience and their motivations and agendas, and seemed to relate to them, appreciate them. Because she was a woman, it was acceptable for her to be emotional, whereas a man who was too compassionate would not seem masculine. She effectively utilized emotion, which greatly improved the reaction of the government and public. She was very persistent and would never give in to distrust and bias. This made her an extremely effective reformer and greatly improved her efforts by showing that she was serious and that the topic was bigger than one woman, one person. In 1861, the U.S. was swept up in the Civil War, and prison reform was left behind. So when Dorothea Dix...
Different phase of history. Okay, reactions to that? Does anyone have any reactions to that you'd be willing just to kind of share? What stood out for you as something new or different or inspiring? What'd you get from it?
This isn't, after the fact, sometime in the 90s, a team of us went into Dorothea Dix Hospital in Raleigh to look for lead in paint. And we found not a lot compared to another place in Ohio that we went, but it was interesting.
In the 1990s, you say you did that?
Somewhere in the 90s, we went as a team, went looking for lead in paint in Dorothea Dix. Did not find a lot. There was another hospital we went into in Ohio where the lead in paint hung like stalactites off the ceiling. But we didn't find much, but it was kind of strange or interesting to walk through the halls and see all these rooms are relatively small, but to think of the people that were in those rooms for so many years, just a strange experience.
Yeah, thank you. And that was through St. Luke's that you did that?
It was a Research Trial Institute, and we were doing that for either EPA or Housing and Urban Development, HUD.
Okay, all right, great. Yes. Mimi, I don't know that it will stretch.
Okay. Interestingly enough, I went to school with some of her, I don't know how far down the line but two girls that I went to college with were Fran and Patty Dix. And it was acknowledged that their heredity, they had something special about their background, and I did not learn all of this until later. They were remarkable girls. They were obviously somehow on her a brother's side of the family or something, but they looked like her. They had brown hair, brown eyes. They were very straightforward and very helpful and were community leaders. And so the ball kept bouncing down the steps. And I think that's wonderful.
Thank you, Mimi. Yeah. Anyone else? do I dare ask? Go, Steve. Yes.
I just have a question. With all this area she traveled and she throughout the day, how did, or morning there, how did she wind up in
How did she wind up in North Carolina? She was just making her way, it looked like, from that map, kind of the East Coast, right, and down. I guess she hopped over to the West Coast and then came back. You know, word spread, I would imagine. So I don't know, but I would imagine that word spread, and that North Carolina, you know, needed her advocacy as well. Okay, any others? I was just gonna, this is risky, so you don't have to. I guess I shared, you know, a little bit of my personal history with you. How many of us, if you're so willing to kind of just raise your hand or acknowledge or nod your head, have had members of the family or ourselves just included that have had, you know, some mental health struggles and issues? Is anybody willing to? Yeah, it's health, right? It's just a part of health. Okay, thank you for that. All right, well, you know what's kind of next, or maybe you don't. All right, so let's turn our attention to advocacy and to what the Episcopal faith and church and diocese of North Carolina tells us. There's quite a bit about advocacy on the website and through there, and there's a committee involved in that, and specific issues, right, every year that the church and the diocese delves into. I'll just read this piece. It is our holy call and responsibility to build a world driven by love in which all creation can flourish. To do this work, we must be advocates for public laws and policies that create a more just and equitable society. Advocacy begins with a fuller understanding of what we believe, how we are incarnating those beliefs, and a framework for action and change based on the teachings of Christ. Has anybody seen this themselves? We think Greg had. We think Greg's seen it all. Okay. Lovely, right? Our holy call. Time for you guys. So now we have a when is how this one starts. I'm going to invite you to share in triads. Groups of 3 can be nice to have these conversations. Looks like this table is set up already. If you want to get up and move around the room, you know, just to switch things up, besides sitting right next to, you know, your most comfortable person, you can. The questions are, and I hope that you can see them. When did you engage in advocacy of some kind, whether it was personal or political? Personal, right? We can advocate for a person in our family, you know, a neighbor, a friend, right? Or it could be something politically connected, right, that we advocated for on any level. When did you not advocate, but maybe you wished you had, or that sits with you wondering if you should? So if not, like who or what might have helped you to do so, right? What kind of support might you have needed? What kind of, you know, community, something, right? Maybe you just didn't have the time at the time. So when did you not but wish you had, and what might have helped? From a faith perspective, then, complete this sentence. I believe social justice advocacy matters because why, right? So why does it matter to you? All right, are you ready? Get in kind of groups of 3. Mix it up a little bit, if you will. I invite you to share with each other. Greg's going to turn our lights back on so we can see each other. And we can do this for 10 minutes. I was going to say, we're all looking at you.
She was our mother for all of us.
this is a type facility, sheriff took it. She never really died. She died of an overdose. I don't know whether it was deliberate or accidental. That didn't really get to her, but I just, yeah, that would be yes, she did right there. But you tell me, I can't remember a lot of details, but you tell me that some people over there, she said, take a care of her. I think she was glad when she was glad. I was reading into it. That's the way I thought about it. Yeah. So I appreciate Dorothea Dix, and we lived in Asheville. And so we were taken to Raleigh. I mean, it was, my grandmother would call the sheriff and he'd come and get our papers for them. Well, no, my mother and father were divorced. They both had substance abuse issues, mostly alcohol, but then my mother also went into, I don't even know what, she called it Billy. I don't know what she was taking. My grandmother died of shingles. Actually, my grandmother was married to my sister and my mother. Yeah. Oh, she was wonderful. My mother was very loving. You know, I got everything I needed.
She was not mean.
No. She was sick.
Yeah.
But I mean, I knew she had a lot of problems. I was very grateful to my grandmother. After it's all. I was 20. She was 44. She had an overdose. I don't know if it was deliberate or not. I was in college, so I when it all happened. But her sister came to visit, and I think that overwhelmed her, and she took me pills to cope with that. Well, anyway, I'm not sure if we.
To me, one of the most interesting things that's happened in my medical career is that when I first started, mental illness was viewed as a personal failure. It was something that you just tried very much. You could overcome it. Which has really put tremendous growth into people's ability. I mean, probably in the mid to late 60s, they started realizing that mental illness was really caused in large part, in many cases, by chemical changes in the brain. It had nothing to do with your will, nothing to do with your innate goodness. It was a disease like diabetes. So, lacking something like this, you have too much of something like neurotransmitter. So people began to, there was a shift in how mental illness was treated. At least, I should say, psychotic mental illnesses were treated from hospitalization and institutionalization by actually medications. And it was kind of it. You could change these kind of personal flaws, given medicines, and make them better. This was a huge change because it moved mental illness out of the realm of the social, the medical. It was a medical to be dealt with. I think places like Dix were wonderful because they showed compassion. A lot of place for people who had no other resources to
basically receive somebody that's long overdue. Isn't that about we started trying to take people out of those institutions and now talk about having different things on the streets. Hopefully to choose the number of people in this country.
Exactly. In our benefits, that is a double-edged sword. The drugs were able to give mentally ill people a more normal existence. But it didn't give them the skills to cope with the world, but it didn't. And so you're lucky. Those mental hospitals were closed. And the mentally ill simply moved onto the street. But very well, in actual fact, you probably close mental places because they're very expensive to maintain. And example, VA has recognized this. It's recognized the role that the government had in causing that expenses, which is not easy. They're trying to help that not institutionalize people by providing homes and support systems. And so they're still tremendous numbers. Most of the people you see on the street are mental illnesses in one time. We're not doing a very good job. Better than we were back chained prisoners. We still have failures. In the 60s, this awareness started. Now it seems like we're having the same struggle with LGBTQ, with sexuality. Oh, no, you can just take the life conditions, or we can train them how to use it. Not accepting the difference between the brain about one actually do one kind of sexuality and the rest of us is something else. And that is having a hard time with that. So I hope that they eventually come to understand, or more people do, because they're very emotional things, just like all the in mental health. Both of those things tend to indicate critical importance of not judging. Don't apply our own individual standards as we're God. Other people we've done it all we can't understand.
Think back on people having things in the situation that I remember thinking who did abnormal. Now we accept it completely. Much better.
There's a lot of just which is a psychiatrist's Bible as to how you classify disease to recognize that homosexuality is not a disease. It's a normal, very weird experience. So we process that foolishness is not limited to it's widespread.
You see that from the head to the staff, from the military, some of the not fit. Something I read this week, which is real. Back in the gun in Kansas, what artists that their driver's license would be taken.
Okay. I hope you're having good conversations. All right. It sounds like we've had good conversations going on all the way around. I want to show you some material. Kind of, we're going to get to a how. I think we've done a what and a who and a when and a how is coming up, something like that. Anything that you'd like to share about your conversations? You know me, I always toss that out there for folks who want to. Jan? Just because you're outspoken? Yes, sir. Thank you.
One of the things we talked about was.
Uh-oh, get closer.
One of the things we talked about was how what a revolution took place in the understanding of mental illness in the late 20th century. Prior to that, mental illness was looked at as a personal failure, as something that if you just tried hard enough, you could overcome it. And then in the 60s and 70s, psychiatrists began to explore how the brain actually worked and what its chemistry was. And they discovered that many mental illnesses, particularly the so-called psychoses, were not a failure of will. They were biochemical changes in the brain. They were diseases just as much as diabetes was a disease. Instead of not having enough of something like insulin, you had too much of something like a neurotransmitter. And so this changed the paradigm of the way we looked at mental illnesses from something that is a personal failure to looking at it as a disease.
Thank you for that contribution. Exactly. People are still catching up with that notion, aren't they? Yeah. We have some experts in the room.
No more. I don't have a license. To have an opinion, right? Absolutely support what Bill's saying, but also that the catch-up is that it was professionals that were paying attention to that, and most of us, as lay people, wouldn't necessarily, be a part of understanding that. What I would say is that, which is a consistent rant of mine, is that when North Carolina decided to divest itself in 2000 of public mental health centers, everything went down the tubes. They were urging privatization of all mental health services. So by 2004, 2005, there was no public mental health, and there is now no public mental health in the state of North Carolina. It is all private. And it obviously is a huge disservice to the population of North Carolina, and the least of these. And initially, when that started in the 2000s, what happened was a lot of people went into business to make money off the state of North Carolina because they were going to pay big bucks, which they did. And there was an enormous amount of fraud. They were hemorrhaging even more money out of Medicaid because of the folks that went into private practice or into private business. So often that was motivated more by the money than it was by a credential. So somebody could just start a business to hire a few social workers maybe and say they're going to pull this business off. So there were a lot of folks that went were charged with fraud, waste, abuse, and fraud. But at this point now, it's mostly private. Most people, there are not enough beds in the state of North Carolina. They're reviewing, some of you probably know, they're reviewing the involuntary commitment law in the state of North Carolina. They passed a quick law when this young woman was so horribly murdered recently in Charlotte on the bus by a man who was mentally ill. But they didn't put any money behind it, and it was so quick that there's not much planning about it. So they're looking at involuntary commitment, yet again, which they have done forever, and most recently looking at involuntary outpatient commitment. Now that's been around on the books since back in the 80s, because we had a really viable outpatient, involuntary outpatient commitment program at Halifax County Mental Health Center when it existed. Doesn't have any teeth. The problem is, the only thing you can do is if somebody's involuntarily committed, say, to a practice, is if they're not taking their medication. There's no forced medication in an involuntary outpatient commitment. You can pick them up, though, and have them evaluated to see if they meet criteria for involuntary commitment and put them in the hospital that way. Otherwise, they walk. So it's not very useful. And it turns out, of course, in all the wisdom of our current legislature, when they were talking to people, who did they talk to? They talked to mental health professionals, most of whom are considerably younger than I am and haven't any experience with outpatient commitment, as well as the fact they talk to no family or patients that might have some ideas about how best to work with the severely and persistently mentally ill on an outpatient basis. It was never adequately funded. The communities were never adequately funded. And so when they were deinstitutionalizing folks out of the hospital and emptying Dix and other to the street, basically, there were no services there. You know, right now, many of you probably or may know, many EDs hold people in the halls and in their overworked circumstance settings in the ED for weeks because there's no psychiatric bed available for somebody who is being held there for involuntary commitment. It's a travesty, and it's not getting any better, and it won't until it's funded, but then, of course, with RFK in charge, we'll probably get better.
Right. Thank you, Jan. Wow. That was great information. Involuntary commitment in Oklahoma, that was called an EOD, an emergency order of detention. And it meant that someone was a harm to themselves, a harm to others, or incapable of taking care of themselves. And that's where that, if they had a psychiatric diagnosis and they were supposed to be taking meds and they weren't, could come into play because they weren't taking care of themselves. You know, other things would happen in their lives if they weren't on their meds. Okay, so much. Well, our diocese calls us to stand up for people. You know, let's call advocacy that, right? Stand up for people in whatever ways works for us. There is, in fact, a guidebook on faith and citizenship, and they urge us to kind of add to whatever we do already, you know, to stand up. All right, so if you volunteer your time, as some of us do, that's advocacy as well, right? All right, so the how we can stand up for others or advocate as an individual, many of us do this, right? Write your elected official, call your elected official, visit your elected official. How many of us have done one of those three at least? Write, call, visit, okay? How we can as a church is a different conversation, right? So let's take a look at this and end with this and see what reactions we have. Raise awareness in your community, as a church community. We can do this on whatever issues and concerns we choose, right? Is anyone here involved in the prison ministry, those folks who are involved in helping people adjust are you involved in that?
Faith team.
What's it called?
The faith team.
Yes, the faith team is what it's called. Can you tell us about it?
No.
Okay. She knows all about it and she's keeping it to herself. Okay, can you tell us about it?
Yes.
Okay.
Folks that have been released from prison are presented with an option to have a faith team, and those that select a faith team, I forget how many there are in Durham, but we have one faith team here at St. Luke's. We have a partner. We stay with them for a year, roughly a year.
Partnered with someone who's been released and in that readjustment period.
And we are just charged with walking with them for a year. We don't provide any financial support. We're basically friends and kind of advocates for them.
Yeah.
We've had several partners over the years. Monica started here too.
Really? Monty got it started?
This lady started as a
Oh.
I know a little bit about it.
Well, I think you've done some advocacy then. I think you certainly have. So that's not going into the prison, it's that phase where they're coming out and the readjustment into society is so hard because they have no support. So you're talking about walking with them, giving them support, emotional support, and maybe you make a phone call or two on their behalf or help them to find resources, things like that. Is that right?
Yeah.
That's it. Okay, lovely. That's another thing I love about St. Luke's. All right, so let's see what the guidebook tells us to do, faith and citizenship. We can have an adult forum. Ta-da, check, right? We do that, we've done that. We could also have a town hall. That could just be at our church, or that could be public, right, on some issue. If we are curious or need to know about different opinions, different voices, right, a town hall kind of brings everybody together and allows different conversations to happen and people to share their voice on different issues. Town hall. We could do prayer breakfasts, lunches, dinners. Have a public issue forum on something that could be educational for the community is how I think of that. A couple of years ago, I think, I did one, the board allowed me to do one on, or the vestry allowed me to do one on reproductive rights. So I brought in some folks from Planned Parenthood and also from ACLU, and there were 25 or so this year for that one. I don't know what else you all have done, but that's that. Community coalitions to combine resources. I've only been around about 3 years, so there's a whole lot more of you. Greg's been here less, I know that, okay. But, you know, does St. Luke's do work with other Episcopal churches? Do we have kind of a coalition? Actually, Monty and I attended, and Kathy attended a really cool thing recently with People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. So you're involved in coalitions related to anti-racism sorts of things, right? Okay, so these are things we can do as a church. We can use the media. This would not be my forte, believe it or not, but we've got some folks here who can. Social media platforms in particular are the new thing, right? Newspapers are around, radio or TV, that sounds somewhat expensive, but we can use that media to get out the word about and take a stand on whatever issue we're concerned about, right? And we can vote, and that would be individually or as a community, to be a part of that. You know, there are some churches in town who, well, actually, St. Luke's did last term, had the voting, the election site was here, you know, because they needed it to be, I think. Can you see that? We can join or create an advocacy day. There could be some of us who, you know, go up to the General Assembly, you know, visit with legislators if we want to, if we choose to. And there's something about doing that in community with others that adds to the momentum, right? It helps us to not feel alone in our concerns, you know, to visit with others. So, yeah, this is kind of the stuff I do, and that's all I've got. What perfect timing. Thank you all so much for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. That was helpful. That was inspiring to learn about Dorothea. That's amazing work. Again, just as a quick preview for next Sunday's Adult Forum, you know, one of the greatest fallacies that I think Christians can fall into is thinking that the Bible is univocal, that it's one voice, consistent throughout, and that our understanding of God now is the same as it was 3,000 years ago. And rather, we talk about evolution as the meta-narrative. It's the great story of finite humanity, generation after generation, slowly growing and evolving in their understanding of the divine and who our God is. For example, the earliest believers, when we look back at what people wrote about and what people believed, was that there was one supreme God, El, the creator, and that El had a council of gods, and El was the great one, but then El would assign each land their own deity, and Israel got Yahweh. So Yahweh was a part of the divine council, but not El. And the deity was landlocked in that territory, only had power there. So when Israel would fight another nation, that was your God fighting their God. So how did we go from, and Yahweh was primarily a war desert storm god. So how do we go from Yahweh being a landlocked sub-deity that was a warrior storm god to our understanding of God now, Yahweh as monotheistic, all-powerful creator of the universe? That's what we'll explore next Sunday. So it's really interesting stuff.
Sounds like a piece of cake.
Exactly, piece of cake. And we'll wrap it up in a bow. But I really think it's inspiring how we recognize that it was evolving then, and because we're finite humans still growing, it's continuing to evolve, our understanding of divine reality and divine love. So I encourage you to come out next Sunday. All right, thanks everybody. See you then.